The Montana highway stretched endlessly under the October moon as Jake gripped the steering wheel. Without warning, his vision blurred. In that split second, he saw it all: twisted metal, shattered glass. Sarah's scream cut short. The collision at Devil's Curve, just ahead. His hands trembled as reality snapped back. "Stop the car!" he screamed, slamming the brakes as the curve appeared in their headlights, exactly as he'd seen in a vision that would haunt them forever. The Subaru Outback screeched to a halt just 50 feet before Devil's Curve, gravel crunching under the tires as Jake's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. The smell of burning rubber filled the October air, mixing with the pine scent drifting from the surrounding Montana wilderness. "Jesus, Jake! What the hell was that about?" Ryan shouted from the passenger seat, his heart still pounding from the sudden stop. Sarah leaned forward from the back, her hand touching Jake's shoulder with concern. "I saw it," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine's idle. "The crash. Right there at that curve. Metal everywhere, glass dot, blood." His dark eyes stared ahead at the seemingly innocent bend in the road, illuminated by their headlights cutting through the darkness. Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Ryan. "Babe, you're exhausted. We've been driving for 6 hours straight from Seattle. Maybe we should—" "No, you don't understand." Jake turned to face them, his usually calm demeanor cracked with urgency. "It wasn't a daydream or fatigue. I saw us die in that curve. All three of us." The wind whistled through the tall pines lining Highway 2, creating an eerie soundtrack to Jake's confession. Ryan, ever the skeptic despite his small-town Montana roots, shook his head. "Look, man, I've driven this road 1,000 times. Yeah, Devil's Curve is tricky, especially at night, but—" A distant rumble interrupted him. Headlights appeared in their rearview mirror, growing brighter. A semi-truck was approaching fast, too fast for the winding mountain road. "Get us out of here," Sarah said quietly, sensing something Jake couldn't explain but trusting his instincts anyway. Jake shifted into drive and pulled forward slowly, his mind racing. The vision had been so vivid, their car spinning out of control, the truck unable to stop, the sickening sound of impact. But they were safe now, moving away from the curve. As they drove past Devil's Curve, Jake glanced in his rearview mirror just as the semi-truck rounded the bend behind them. In the reflection, for just a moment, he saw it again: twisted metal, flames, the exact same scene from his vision. He blinked hard, and the mirror showed only the truck's headlights disappearing around another curve. "Did you guys see that?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "See what?" Ryan turned to look back, but the road behind them was empty now. The GPS announced their next turn in 2 miles, a shortcut Ryan had suggested that would take them through the back roads to their cabin rental near Glacier National Park. What was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway was turning into something else entirely. Sarah noticed Jake's hand shaking as he drove. "Hey, pull over at the next rest stop. Let me drive for a while." But Jake knew that stopping might be exactly what the vision wanted. In his mind, he could still see the moment of impact, the way time seemed to slow as death approached. The highway stretched ahead, dark and unforgiving, and every reflection in his mirrors seemed to whisper the same message: "You can't escape what's already been decided." 20 miles past Devil's Curve, Jake finally allowed Sarah to convince him to pull over at a rest stop, a small, poorly lit area with a few picnic tables and vending machines humming in the darkness. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the cracked asphalt. Sarah slid into the driver's seat while Ryan stepped out to stretch his legs, his breath visible in the cold mountain air. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and frost was beginning to form on the car windows. "You're scaring me, Jake," Sarah said softly as she adjusted the mirrors. "This isn't like you. You're usually so logical, so grounded." Jake stared at his reflection in the passenger side mirror, but instead of his own face, He glimpsed something else, brake lights illuminating in panic, the sound of screaming tires. He jerked away from the mirror. I know how it sounds, but I can't shake this feeling. It's like I'm seeing our death on repeat, and every mirror, every reflection is showing me the same thing. Ryan climbed back into the passenger seat, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Look, maybe we should just head back to Kalispell. Get a hotel room for the night. We can hit the cabin tomorrow when we're all fresh. As Sarah pulled back onto the highway, Jake noticed something unsettling. Every reflective surface, the side mirrors, the rearview mirror, even the dark windows of passing cars, seemed to flash images of the accident for split seconds. A wheel spinning through the air, shattered safety glass sparkling like deadly confetti. The twisted remains of their car wrapped around a tree. Take the next exit, Jake said suddenly. But that's not the way to... I don't care. Take it. Sarah followed his instructions, turning off onto a smaller state road that wound through dense forest. The GPS immediately began recalculating, its electronic voice announcing they were now taking a much longer route. For a moment, Jake felt relief. They were off the main highway, away from the heavy truck traffic and the dangerous curves. Maybe changing their route would change their fate. But as they drove through the winding forest road, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. In every reflective surface, the chrome bumper of a parked ranger vehicle, a "Welcome to Montana" sign, even puddles of water from the recent rain. The same vision played out like a broken record. Stop the car, he said quietly. Jake, stop the car now. Sarah pulled over onto the shoulder, and Jake got out, walking to the front of the car. In the headlight's reflection off a road sign, he saw it again clearer this time. The accident wasn't happening on Devil's Curve. It was happening here, on this very road. A deer would bolt from the forest, Sarah would swerve, and they would hit the massive pine tree just ahead. He looked up from the reflection to see a doe standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes glowing in their headlights, muscles tense to run. Everyone out of the car, Jake said, his voice deadly calm. Now, Ryan and Sarah exchanged looks but complied, stepping out into the cold night air. The moment they cleared the vehicle, the deer bounded across the road, directly through the space where their car had been seconds before. How did you know? Sarah whispered, staring at Jake with a mixture of awe and fear. Jake didn't answer. He was looking at the side mirror of their car, where the reflection showed not the empty road behind them, but flames. Always flames. And in the distance, the sound of sirens that hadn't arrived yet, but would. Jake. The highway, it seemed, had many ways to claim its victims. And Jake was beginning to understand that no matter which route they took, the road would find a way to collect what it believed it was owed. They stood in the freezing Montana night, their breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air, as Jake tried to explain what he couldn't fully understand himself. The deer had disappeared into the forest, but its message was clear. Every path they chose led to the same destination. "We're walking," Jake announced, his decision cutting through the silence like the wind through the pines. "Walking?" "Jake, it's 30 miles to the cabin, and it's below freezing," Ryan protested, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders. "Look, I get that you're freaked out, but leaving the car here is insane." Sarah moved closer to Jake, studying his face in a dim light from their vehicle. "What exactly are you seeing in these reflections?" Jake glanced at the car's side mirror one more time. The reflection showed their Subaru wrapped around the pine tree they'd just avoided, flames licking at the fuel tank. But now there was something new, a second accident, further down this same road. A rock slide triggered by their attempts to avoid the first death. "It's not just one accident," he said, his voice hollow with realization. "Every choice we make, every turn we take, it just creates a new way for us to die. The highway wants us, and it's going to keep showing me how until we give in." A truck rumbled past on the main road behind them, its engine noise fading into the distance. The sound reminded Jake of the semi from his original vision, and he shuddered. Sarah made a decision. Okay, we walk. But not on the road. Through the forest. Ryan stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Through the Montana wilderness? At night? In October? That's suicide, Sarah. Maybe, she said quietly. But at least it's not the death Jake keeps seeing. They gathered what they could from the car flashlights, water bottles, a first aid kit, and the warm blanket Sarah always kept for emergencies. Jake left the keys in the ignition and the doors unlocked. Someone will find it in the morning, he said, though he wasn't sure if morning would come for them. The forest was dark and thick, filled with the sounds of nocturnal wildlife and the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. Their flashlight beams created moving circles of light that danced across tree trunks and undergrowth as they picked their way carefully between the pines. For the first hour, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since his vision began hope. There were no reflective surfaces in the deep woods, no mirrors to show him their impending death. Just trees, darkness, and the steady crunch of pine needles under their feet. But as they walked deeper into the wilderness, Jake began to notice something troubling. Every time they passed a small stream or pond, every time their flashlight beam caught a wet rock or a puddle of rainwater, the reflections were there. Clearer now, more detailed. He saw Sarah falling into a ravine they hadn't reached yet. Ryan being attacked by a mountain lion that was already tracking their scent. Himself, lost and freezing, dying alone under the stars. We need to keep moving, he said, pushing them forward even as his legs grew heavy with exhaustion and fear. Sarah caught his arm. Jake, you're bleeding. He looked down at his hands, scratched by branches he didn't remember encountering. In the small droplets of blood on his knuckles, he saw their deaths reflected like tiny, perfect horror films. It's following us, he whispered. Even here, even away from the road, it's following us. A wolf howled in the distance, and Jake realized that the highway's reach extended far beyond asphalt and yellow lines. The entire landscape was complicit in their fate. Every surface that could hold a reflection was a window into their inevitable end. Ryan, who had been growing increasingly skeptical and angry, finally snapped. This is insane. We're going to die out here. Not because of some supernatural highway curse, but because we're three city people stumbling around the Montana wilderness in the dark. But even as he spoke, he caught sight of his own reflection in Jake's phone screen. And in that dark surface, he saw exactly what Jake had been seeing all along. The truth that no amount of skepticism could deny. They were already dead. They just hadn't stopped moving yet. Dawn broke over the Montana wilderness with the pale, cold light that comes just before winter. Jake, Sarah, and Ryan had been walking for 6 hours through terrain that seemed designed to claim the lost and desperate. Their phone batteries were nearly dead. Their water was gone, and the temperature continued to drop. Jake's visions had evolved throughout the night. Now, every reflection in ice-covered puddles, in the polished surface of Ryan's watch, even in Sarah's tear-filled eyes showed not just their deaths, but the exact sequence of events leading to them. He could see the next 24 hours laid out like a roadmap to tragedy. There, Sarah pointed through the trees with a shaking hand. I can see a road. It was Highway 2 again. Somehow, despite walking in what they thought was a straight line away from it, they had circled back to the very road they'd tried to escape. Jake realized now that geography itself was conspiring against them, bending space and direction to ensure they met their fate. Ryan collapsed against a tree, his face pale with exhaustion and hypothermia. I can't walk anymore, man. My feet are numb. Jake knelt beside his friend, and in the surface of a frozen puddle nearby, he saw Ryan's death clearly now. Not from the cold, not from exhaustion, but from something far more immediate. A helicopter would spot them from the road. Rescue would come, but in the chaos of the emergency landing, Ryan would be struck by the rotor blade. "No helicopters," Jake said suddenly. "When they come to rescue us, no helicopters." Sarah looked at him with concern. "What are you talking about?" "We need help, Jake. Ryan needs medical attention." As if summoned by her words, they heard the distant sound of rotor blades approaching from the east. Jake grabbed his friends and pulled them deeper into the tree line, but he knew it was too late. The pilot had already spotted their bright-colored jackets against the white frost. The helicopter circled overhead, its PA system crackling to life. "We're going to set down in the clearing. Stay where you are." Jake watched in the reflection of Sarah's phone screen as the events played out exactly as he'd foreseen. The helicopter touched down in a small meadow 50 yards away, its rotors still spinning. Ryan, delirious from cold and exhaustion, stumbled toward the aircraft instead of waiting for the rescue crew to come to them. "Ryan, no!" Jake lunged forward, tackling his friend to the ground just as the pilot shut down the engines. The rotor blade that would have killed Ryan passed harmlessly overhead, slowing to a stop. For a moment, Jake felt victorious. He had changed the outcome. He had cheated death. But when he looked into the helicopter's windshield, the reflection showed him the truth. Ryan was safe, yes, but now the sequence had changed. Sarah would slip on the icy ground as they approached the aircraft. She would hit her head on the helicopter's skid. The impact would be fatal. Sarah, wait. But she was already moving toward their rescuers, her feet sliding on the frost-covered grass. Jake reached for her, his fingers brushing her jacket just as she fell backward. Time seemed to slow as Jake made a choice. Instead of pulling her away from danger, he threw himself between Sarah and the helicopter's metal skid. The impact sent stars exploding across his vision, but Sarah was safe, landing softly in the grass beside him. As consciousness faded, Jake saw his final reflection in the helicopter pilot's sunglasses. He had saved his friends, but the highway had claimed its due. In trying to cheat death, he had simply chosen which of them would pay the price. The last thing he heard was Sarah screaming his name, and the distant sound of an ambulance siren growing closer, a siren that would arrive just minutes too late to save the one person who had seen it all coming. The ambulance ride to Kalispell Regional Medical Center became Jake's final journey, though the paramedics fought desperately to keep him conscious. Sarah held his hand while Ryan, now stable and warming, sat in stunned silence. The head trauma from the helicopter's metal skid had caused internal bleeding that no amount of medical intervention could stop. "Sir, stay with us," the paramedic urged, checking Jake's pupils with a small flashlight. But Jake was somewhere else entirely, trapped in a space between life and death where every surface still showed reflections of what was to come. In the ambulance's medical equipment, in the IV bag swaying above him, in Sarah's eyes filled with tears, Jake saw the aftermath of his sacrifice. Sarah would blame herself for his death. She would move back to Seattle, but the guilt would follow her, manifesting in panic attacks whenever she drove past reflective surfaces. Ryan would quit his job at the garage and move to California, unable to look at another car without seeing Jake's face. The highway had taken its payment, but the debt would echo through the lives of those who survived. "Jake, please don't leave me," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't do this without you." Jake wanted to tell her that his death was not the end, but the beginning of something worse. The visions weren't stopping. They were expanding. He could see other travelers on Highway 2, other victims whose fates were already decided. A family from Oregon whose tire would blow out at Devil's Curve in 2 weeks. A truck driver who would fall asleep at the wheel during tomorrow's morning shift. A teenage couple whose first date would become their last. The highway collected its due with methodical patience. And now Jake understood that his premonition had not been a gift meant to save them. It had been a recruitment. As the ambulance turned into the hospital's emergency bay, Jake saw his reflection one last time in the rear window. but it wasn't showing his death anymore. It was showing him what came after. He would become part of the highway's consciousness, another voice whispering warnings to drivers who would never listen in time. The medical team rushed him into the trauma bay, but Jake was already gone, his final breath escaping as the automatic doors closed behind them. The last sound he heard was not Sarah's sobs or the frantic orders of the doctors, but the distant rumble of traffic on Highway 2, calling to him like a siren song. Dr. Amanda Foster, the attending physician, would later tell Sarah and Ryan that Jake's injuries should have killed him instantly. The fact that he survived the helicopter ride to the hospital was medically impossible. She couldn't explain how someone with such massive internal trauma had remained conscious long enough to squeeze Sarah's hand one final time and whisper something that the paramedics couldn't quite hear. But Sarah had heard it clearly. Watch the mirrors. They never lie. 3 days later, Jake's funeral was held at a small chapel in Whitefish, Montana, with a view of the same mountains where he had died. Sarah and Ryan sat in the front row, still trying to make sense of what had happened on that terrible night. After the service, as they walked to their rental car for the drive back to Seattle, Ryan noticed something that made his blood run cold. In every reflective surface, the chapel windows, their car's paint, even Sarah's sunglasses, he could see Jake's face, lips moving as if trying to speak a warning they could no longer hear. The highway had claimed its victim, but Jake Martinez had become something more than just another casualty. He had become a guardian of sorts, forever watching from the other side of every reflection, trying to warn travelers about the dangers ahead. But warnings, as Jake had learned too late, were only useful to those who could hear them in time. 6 months after Jake's death, Sarah Chun found herself driving Highway 2 again, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain and didn't want to understand. She had sold her Seattle apartment and taken a job with a small advertising firm in Kalispell, telling herself she needed a fresh start, somewhere peaceful to heal. But peace was the last thing Montana offered her. Every night, she dreamed of Jake's final moments, of his desperate attempt to save them all. During the day, she caught glimpses of his face in storefront windows, in the surface of her morning coffee, in the rearview mirror of her new Honda Civic. At first, she thought it was grief playing tricks on her mind. Now she knew better. Jake was trying to tell her something. The Honda's clock read 11:47 p.m. as Sarah approached Devil's Curve, the same stretch of road where their nightmare had begun. She had been avoiding this route for months, but tonight felt different. Tonight, Jake's reflections had been more urgent, more desperate. As she rounded the curve, her headlights illuminated a scene that made her heart stop. A family in an Oregon-licensed minivan had pulled over to change a flat tire. A father, mother, and 2 small children stood beside their vehicle, completely unaware of the semi-truck approaching from behind, its driver nodding off after a 16-hour haul. Sarah saw it all in her windshield's reflection, the truck drifting into the shoulder, the family's final moments of terror, the explosion of metal and glass that would leave no survivors. But overlaid on this vision was Jake's face, his lips forming words she could finally hear. Save them. Without hesitation, Sarah accelerated past the family and into the path of the oncoming truck, laying on her horn and flashing her lights. The truck driver jerked awake, hit his brakes, and swerved back into his lane just as Sarah pulled her car onto the opposite shoulder. The family was safe. The truck continued on its way, and Sarah understood with crystal clarity what Jake had become. She was not the first person to experience premonitions on Highway 2. The road was old, older than the state of Montana itself, built on ancient hunting trails where Native American shamans had once walked, speaking with spirits and seeing visions of what was to come. Over the decades, the highway had collected the souls of those who died with unfinished business, transforming them into eternal sentries who tried to prevent future tragedies. Jake had joined their ranks, but unlike the others, he had found a way to reach the living. Through Sarah, through the bond they had shared in life, he could project his warnings to those who still had time to act on them. As Sarah sat in her car, shaking from adrenaline and revelation, she felt Jake's presence more strongly than ever before. In the reflection of her phone screen, she saw not just his face, but dozens of others victims of Highway 2 from decades past, all of them trapped between worlds, all of them trying to save lives through the only medium available to them, reflections. "I understand now," she whispered to the darkness. "I'll be your voice in the world of the living." Over the following months, Sarah became something of a local legend. She would appear at accident scenes moments before they happened, warning drivers about black ice, mechanical failures, and medical emergencies. The Montana State Police couldn't explain how she always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, but they stopped questioning her after the 15th life she saved. Sarah had become the living embodiment of the highway's collective consciousness, guided by Jake and the other guardian spirits who watched from every reflective surface. She had found her purpose in the most unlikely place, not in healing from tragedy, but in preventing it for others. But the highway's hunger was never satisfied. For every life saved, it demanded new payment. And Sarah began to understand that her role as a guardian would eventually require the ultimate sacrifice. One day, she too would join Jake in the realm of reflections, becoming another voice trying to reach across the boundary between life and death. Until that day came, she would drive the endless highways of Montana, watching the mirrors, listening for warnings, and saving lives with knowledge that came from the other side of reality. The road never forgets, and neither would she. Next time, discover the truth about Exit 13, where travelers check in but never check out. What secrets lie buried beneath the Sleepy Pine Motel? And why do guests keep reporting the same child crying in room 237? The highway has many stories to tell, and some destinations are more than they appear to be.